As principal of the college, in an unexpected role for me, I'm very conscious after nearly 2 years of the responsibility and privilege of giving some principal oversight to the college. And by my way of counting, there's been 11 principals prior to this era, and we have 3 of them here tonight. So I'm going to ask in chronological order each of those principals just to bring a word of encouragement. And David has already said to me, if he goes on too long, take the microphone away. Well, I won't do that, but I'll think of a strategy. So David Stewart, known to many of you, was the principal of the college here from the mid-1960s through the 1970s into the 1980s. Ian Kemp followed on from David as principal at the end of the 80s, and then John Hitchen as principal through the 90s, and each of them made invaluable contributions to the life of the college. So without any further ado, unaccustomed as he is to public speaking, here is David Stewart.
Thank you, Rod. I've no idea what I should say. Perhaps unusual, I hope, for principal, unlike Rod. But I think when we came to college back in 1965, the first thing is that we came with a very definite sense of God guiding us. For 6 months, I had been, first of all, in China for 2 years, and the communists weren't too keen on us missionaries, so we all had to leave, 1951. And then my wife and I married in 51, and we were in India for 11 years in charge of a high school, an English medium high school. And they were wonderful years, but I somehow sensed in the last year, for a number of reasons, that my time was coming to an end. I think probably Dorothy sensed it before I did, but we went on a year's leave in 1964, and I promised to let them know before September the 1st whether I was coming back or not. We'd actually just been on that trip, and we came to New Zealand, and we had some time with university missions here, and then we went on to the States, and there I felt clear leading that I was to cease as principal of Mount Hermon School in India. So I sent my resignation in August, and we had not the foggiest notion what we were going to do. We continued on our trip. It was a world trip for us, taking our little boy, David, who was 4 at the stage, and we finished our world trip and ended up at Mount Hermon, packed up our goods, and came on the ship, the Iberia. I was reminded last night back to Australia, wondering what does the Lord have for us? Many thoughts passed through our mind, but I sensed that when we got to Sydney, it would be for us like Troas was for Paul, that after a period of great uncertainty for Paul, and you can sense that if you read Acts 16 sensitively. Troas was where he got guidance to go to Europe. Well, we came back to Australia, and within 2 hours, of reaching Sydney, the guidance came. That Saturday morning it was, when a letter came from one of the members of the board here at Bible College telling us that Alan Burrow had resigned and the board had accepted his resignation. Could they consider my name? 2 hours after we reached Sydney. Les used to recount it to me. I told him from my angle, and I said, oh, it only took us about 40 seconds and we knew this is what the Lord has for us. He said it took the board a bit longer than that. Well, they called me over and I had a look. But we came with a sense that God brought us here. And for us it was a new thing. We had never been in a Bible college. I was trained in a theological college in Sydney. And I didn't really know a great deal about Bible college, but I came expecting, what's the Lord going to do? And Bible college was just wonderful. It really was. What appealed to me so much was the openness of the college. It was not one denomination, but we had many, and in our time, I think the board got willing to accept people from other denominations that hadn't come here before. And that was a joy to me. And we had our problems, but you know, it was just wonderful coming to this place. We had a wonderful fellowship amongst the staff. Les Rushbrook, the indefatigable secretary, treasurer, and sometimes acting principal of the college, and Frank England, and John Pritchard, and Rob Kirkby. Terrible how you have to think about names, isn't it, at my age? Anyhow, we had a sense of just deep fellowship between the five of us. Others came later, but I suppose it wasn't quite the same, because we, being more, you couldn't be quite so close. And we did have some variations on the staff, but on the whole, it was a very happy staff. And then we had a wonderful lot of students. Many of you here were our students in my day. And I think if there was one thing the faculty used to complain about me was I gave too much time to the students and not enough to the faculty. And I guess it was true, because I felt the students are my job. And I suppose I always had a special penchant for the people who don't fit in. And we had a number of people, and I keep in touch still with some who perhaps are thought of as having gone off the rails. But you just hang on. You never know when God will bring them back. Anyhow, the students were wonderful. And I remember a number of days I'd come to the office in the morning and I'd think to myself, a bit gluttonously, I suppose, I'm in a wonderful job. And then I think, this is the most wonderful job in New Zealand. With the people we were touching, because it was the students and the churches they came from, and presently we started in the South Island with our first branches and so on. And I would think this is the most wonderful job in New Zealand. And then I think this is the most wonderful job in the world. And it was. And so we were here for 24 years. It was a bit difficult at the end. I had a stroke a year before I retired, and the board were very hesitant about employing this man who might die on the spot for them. And the expert from the doctor that they asked for a reference said, Mrs. Stewart's made a remarkable recovery, and I did. Within a few months, I really was feeling fit. I wasn't quite as robust. And that story about me on the volleyball court, I did play volleyball better before I had my stroke, I assure you. But I had the stroke, and then in the last year it was difficult, and the board wondered whether they'd bitten off more than they could chew, because the doctor said, you've got to realise Mr. Stewart has had quite a severe stroke, and the chances are 50-50 that he'll have another stroke within a year and die. And they thought, well. However, I fought against the board then, and though last year was a bit difficult and a bit different, it was a wonderful year, a wonderful conclusion in '88. Well, we saw a lot in the college. We saw faculty, good faculty. We had, I think, some excellent men. In the early days, we weren't so well qualified academically, perhaps, but we had good men and good women in Jean Jaggers, you know. She, yes, she kept her eye on all of us. And but one saw a good faculty, and I think I was able to persuade the board to welcome into that faculty a lot of very fine men, most of whom stayed with us for a long time. The first lot all died in action, virtually, and stayed right through until I retired. But as I think of that, I think, what did my 24 years do? And I think in many ways, as I look back, I've had, by the way, 24 years since I retired. So it's 24 now. And I think we were developing. We had big changes in my day. Now, they don't seem very big when you look at the enormous changes since. You look at, but we dreamed those changes in my time. So many of them. You know, in my time, we talked a great deal about starting a school here, particularly for training teachers. That was way back in the 1970s. We didn't get to do it, but it's happened. And we started in Christchurch, and then the other in Wellington and Palmerston North and Nelson, we had, and Dunedin, we had our branch colleges. And there's that development, and there was development here. We built the first library, and the first library is straight up above. It's not going to fall on you, though. It's all right. It's fallen down long ago. And of course, it was folk like Bob Glenn, who was our faculty librarian, and Denise James and others who dreamt of a much bigger library that could cater for a future bigger, wider reaching college. And we've seen it happen. And I think, well, my 24 years were not a conclusion in themselves, but they were a preparation. God moves, and one can see how God has moved and how the present college has grown out of all proportion, so wonderfully, so amazingly. The sheer cost of it would have been unthinkable to us back in 1988. I petitioned, I think it was 3 prime ministers successively for us to get a degree, you know. But of course they wouldn't in New Zealand. And then the year I retired, they called the Hawke Report, and it all changed. And now, the Bible College, as it was for us, Laidlaw College as it's now called, is a foremost Bible and theological college in New Zealand, and in fact I think in the Southern Hemisphere. We are unique. So we've got a few present students here, and I do want to encourage you. We see you fulfilling the next steps of that great heritage that God planned for this place, right from the time He called us here. God bless you all.
Let's welcome Ian Kemp to speak with us. Thank you, Ian.
When David had his stroke, I was the understudy because he had already asked me to be the vice principal. I come to you tonight particularly with the younger ones in mind because I feel like a runner in the Olympics. Don't look like one, but I have in my hand a baton, and I'm passing it on to the people who are to run after me. And I want to make 3 points about my time here, in which I hope this point will be made clear to you. When David had his stroke, because I was vice principal, immediately overnight I became principal. I didn't ask for it, I wasn't qualified for it, I didn't want it, but I had to take it. And I don't know whether you find yourself in situations like that from time to time. I guess we all do. We don't want to do things, but we're in a situation where we just got to do it. And I pray that God will give me the strength and the wisdom. I know today, and many of you know, that I'm not principal material, but I survived for 2.5 years and I managed to hold things together and make way for the next man, who was John Hitchen. But I just make that point, that when you find yourself in a tight corner and you're confronted with something that you think you just cannot face, step forth, claim the power of God, and go forth by His grace and do it. That's one baton I'm giving you to pass on tonight. While I was here, I had a chance to look all over New Zealand to find people who would join the faculty. And I did what any responsible Christian leader ought to be doing. I prayed that God would give me the wisdom to tap people on the shoulder and say, had you ever thought of coming to serve at the Bible College of New Zealand? Of course, it wasn't my authority to invite them, but it was my initiative to tap them on the shoulder. I'll tell you who they were. One was Stewart. I found him in Tuatapere, way down in the south of the South Island. And another one I found even further south than that was Paul Windsor, who was in Invercargill at the time. And the other one that I can remember quite clearly was Stewart was in Auckland at the time. And there were one or two more. Merv Coates, thank you for that, yes. Merv Coates. And there was even one more whose name won't come to me. But I tapped them on the shoulder and I said, would you ever consider coming here? And when I found there was some kind of response, I made a recommendation to the board, and the board said, okay. And these men have come, and for years and years they've made their mark. And Stewart is still with us, and Paul has moved on to greater things at Kerry College and now into the Langham Fellowship. And I thank God for that. And I pass that on to you as a baton tonight to you young people. Look out, as a Christian leader, look out for potential leaders to follow you. Because you're not going to last forever. Tap them on the shoulder. Make suggestions to them as you recognize the gifts of God in them. And then let the Lord work through them. That's the second thing I want to say to you. The third thing is about absolute commitment. When I was here, I was teaching missions all the time, and again and again and again, as I worked through missiological issues, I was encouraging students to be committed to the Lord Jesus Christ. You know, I served in India for many years, and I taught in a college very similar to this one, and we had our alumni reunions from time to time, and I remember on one occasion, the 25th anniversary of our college it was, students came from all over India, and we had photographs pinned up around the wall about the students, the alumni, people in the past, and we go around and said, yeah, this fellow is working this place, this one, yeah, and this one, and where's the, oh, he's no longer in service, and yes, this one, and he's no longer in service either. And whenever I heard that, I had an ache in my heart. We spent our prayers, we spent our energies. In fact, some of us travelled overseas to go to India to train people that they might hear the call of God and go forth into service and stick with it. You know what the trap I used to find in India? I would ask students what they were going to do after their graduation. Oh, sir, I'm going for further studies. And I knew what that meant. Going to America, getting a degree and settling in America and never going back to India again. My heart ached every time I heard that. And I want to say to you folks who are training for degrees right now, or have been recently, and some of you are still striving for the doctorates, it's not the degrees, it's not the doctorates, it's not all the acclaim that goes with that. If you're not committed to Jesus Christ and prepared to stick with it when the going's tough, if God has called you to the task, stick with it and trust His grace to carry you through.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you, David. And now I'd like to invite John Hitchen to speak to us.
Well, as you know now, Anne and I had the privilege of following David and Ian. We had been, of course, for 15 years in Papua New Guinea. We had close on 5 years doing postgraduate study in Aberdeen. We'd returned to New Zealand expecting to return to the Pacific, only to find that because of medical reasons we were told we had to stay in New Zealand and couldn't be away from surgical help and things like this. So after a couple of years of telling the Lord that Ichabod wasn't the name I wanted over the top of my my ministry, but thinking that's what it was. In 1987, we had the privilege of picking up the role of Dean of the Christchurch branch of Bible College, and came back into Bible College work and on the staff there. And then in 1990, was appointed as national principal up here. I've had the privilege of, after 9 years in the role, we resigned at the end of 98, but I haven't actually left the college. I retired from the principalship, but apart from study leaves and things like that, I've had the privilege of continuing in different roles on the college since then. So we've had the privilege of actually seeing Brian Hathaway's principalship, Hudson Dean, who had been our regional supervisor when I was principal, taking over as principal here after Brian's tragic death, and then of course being here through Mark Strom's period, and now watching as Rod's picked things up. So I had the privilege of actually being involved right through that whole time. And we've seen a number of things. We've seen a lot of things suggested as being totally new that people were going to do, and we sort of bit our tongue and smiled quietly and remembered what David had done first to prepare the way, and what had happened to make it all possible, and all these great new things that were happening, and we knew something about the roots that had been there and that sort of thing. But it's been a huge privilege to actually see the way in which the great central foundations, and I've been thrilled, like I think everybody has today, just to hear Rod repeating what it is that Bible College has always stood for, but giving it that present-day slant. And as we've seen again, how the heritage is being rephrased in fresh ways, but it's still the same heritage. And so my understanding is I was asked to give a word of encouragement. Well, my encouragements will be just to remind us all tonight of the words that Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy, the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. 3 key words. He starts off and says, what you have heard from me. But I'm going to say, what you have heard from BTI, from Bible College, from Laidlaw. What we've heard, each of us, from our experience within this college and all that it's been over the years. What we've heard, keep as the pattern of sound teaching with faith and love in Christ Jesus. And that would be the most important first step, isn't it? What we've heard, what our heritage represents, let's keep it. And as I see the current generation of students, I'm working mostly these days in the postgraduate program, well, totally in the postgraduate program with the master's course, but I see what's happening in the undergraduate program from time to time too. I see that the situation that our students come from is one in which they've got all kinds of alternative patterns being thrust upon them to live by, and being thrust upon them with amazing technical skill, with all sorts of deeper pressures than we ever had in our day as young people. And yet the message is still the same, isn't it? Keep as our pattern for life what we've received in terms of the heritage of the evangelical faith that we've been reminding ourselves about the last few hours. And I thank God that that's what the college is still doing. We're still about helping people to actually live by the pattern of the faith once given to the saints. And we have the privilege of seeing that being worked out time and time again in the life of the college today. And I want to say to all of us tonight, let's go out from here and from this reunion recommitted to keeping hold of that as our pattern. I find it's awfully easy as an older person these days, and I didn't think I was ever going to be able to say that about myself, to let things slide a bit, to think we've sort of arrived, and to not be so careful about the routines, the devotional emphases, the actual relationship with the Lord. But we do need to hang on to it, don't we? And we need to be committed to ending well. And that's what I think Timothy's challenging us, or Paul's challenging Timothy to do, and we can hear it tonight. End well. Keep going to the end. Keep on making the pattern that we've received through our heritage, through the college, the pattern by which we live. But do it with faith and love, with a fresh recommitment of a real living relationship with Christ. That's what faith is, isn't it? Not some external or merely mental thing, but it's the living relationship with the Lord, and it's a growing love on a broader and broader basis. I find it very easy to become a grumpy old man. But grumpy old men are not loving old men. And the challenge for us older ones is, with our continuing in the faith, to make sure we're continuing in love. And that should be a growing, broadening, increasing thing, shouldn't it, rather than a narrowing thing. So first, keep as our pattern that which the college passed on to us. But then Paul goes straight on and he says, guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you. Guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit who lives in us. Guard our evangelical heritage. Guard our biblical commitment. Guard our holding forth the gospel. Guard it, because there's an awful lot of attacks in fresh and very, very subtle ways that the new generation are facing. When I came to BTI in 1961, I was one of the first group who started here, and the first group here at Henderson. If I think back on it now, I think we have to say that our definition of evangelical, our way of understanding evangelical, is that we were against other groups of Christians. But these days, we can't afford to be against people. We've got the challenge of actually defining what the evangel, what the gospel means in terms of how it confronts the whole world, not just other religious people. And instead of being against other groups, we've got to be for the gospel in the world. And that requires a change of thinking. And I see our present generations of students grappling with that. How do we actually rephrase the gospel? Not so that we're separating ourselves from other groups of Christians, but how we're actually identifying who we are in a world that no longer even thinks of spirituality as focusing on Christ. In a world that says that there's no longer truth anywhere, there's just all sorts of various truths. And how do we rephrase the gospel in terms of this amazing technological age where we can Skype and we can talk to people all around the world and we can have open Facebook relationships with people who are thousands and thousands of miles away? What does it mean to make sure that the evangel is speaking into this kind of social networking world around us? It's a very, very different challenge from what we face as students, and it's great to see the way in which the present generation and the present generation of staff are grappling with that. I actually decided the last time I taught an undergraduate course that I had to actually think hard about whether I was able to keep teaching this younger generation, because I realised, and one or two of them are actually in the room tonight, it's interesting. I was teaching a course in which I realised that for the first time ever, I had some students who were not just reading while I was trying to lecture, but they were actually online, and they clearly were on Trade Me in the middle of my lectures. And I found that really, really hard to take, and I didn't know how to react to it. And it was a real struggle, because I wasn't quite up with the technology in the way they were, but it actually helped me to realise that maybe I had a need to pass things over and had to focus on the postgrad program where things are not quite so difficult to keep people's attention and so on. But I see our lecturers grappling with this. So these days, of course, you can't just lecture in the way I used to do. You've actually got to be up to date with the latest video clips and the latest Facebook bits and pieces, and unless you can actually bring all of these into your teaching methodology, well, then you're just out of it. It doesn't count. Anne and I are getting vivid demonstrations of that because we happen to have our 21-year-old grandson living with us while he's trying to do a Diploma of Biblical Studies here this year. It's really interesting looking at your colleagues through the ideas or through the eyes of a 21-year-old for whom study is actually really difficult. He's an outdoors guy, and to hear his version of what the lecturers think they're doing in the lectures he's attending is quite interesting, I can tell you. Yeah, I'm trying. But that's the point. It's in this totally new world. And I do really plead to us older folk who are graduates of the college, let's realise that that means different questions require different answers, different approaches, a different context in which we're speaking and teaching needs to guard the gospel means different questions from the ones that we've treasured, and the answers that we thought were so important just don't fit today. So when you hear that different lecturers are talking about different things and you can't quite see how they fit in your way of understanding what you got from college, don't judge too quickly. Listen and learn, because they are seriously, they're committed, this faculty here are deeply committed to the same gospel and to the same word, but they're trying to relate it to a quite different world from that in which we actually did it. And they're seeking to guard it in the present day world, not just guard it in the way that we had to in our generation. And we older ones need to be very sensitive to that. And we need to be very supportive of them in their task of guarding the gospel, as we actually make sure we're not just guarding a message which is now out of date, but we're guarding in such a way that it actually has treasure value to the present generation as we go forward. And then, of course, you know the third word. Ian actually has taken my thunder here. It's keep what we've received as our pattern for living. It's guard that treasured deposit of the gospel itself. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, Paul says, and the things you've heard me say, or the things you've heard the college say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men and women who will also be qualified to teach others. That passing on, entrusting to others that which we've received. And I just want to encourage all of our different generations of graduates to remember that if we're going to be able to entrust others with that gospel for their generation, and have you ever thought of how many generations Paul's got in mind here? He says to Timothy, that which you heard me, or that which we received from others, the first group, that which you received from me, pass on to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. Paul has got Timothy, the next generation, in mind. He's asking him to give it to the next generation, so they'll give it to the next generation. And in CLDC language, we often talk about planning for a century, planning for 4 generations ahead of your own one, 3 generations beyond your present one, planning for 100 years. We've got the responsibility of making sure that that's what Laidlaw is able to do for the next 3 generations. And we need to be partnering in this entrusting task. And I'm really excited about the way in which, again, I know David worked hard, I know Ian worked hard, I know we tried and we talked a lot about it, but we never quite got there in the different way that it's necessary to actually develop a lively, active alumni association and to actually be able to get the support and the help of the past students in the present ministry of the college. And I'm really excited about what we've heard this weekend. And I trust that all of us who are part of that older generation, part of the alumni, will actually get on side so that we can continue to entrust the gospel to not just the next, but to the next 3 generations, so that we fill our part in the ongoing purposes of God. Keep what we've received, guard it, and entrust it. And that's what college has always been about. And I want to assure you from the inside it's what it's still all about, but we need to be partnering in that task together. And may the Lord help us in it. And may we find deep joy and growing satisfaction in the way we're doing it too. Thanks, Rod.